Welcome to Free Science Fiction Stories. Today's story is The Stars Are Gone. A chilling tale unfolds in a remote Martian colony as Noah and his fellow colonists grapple with the unthinkable. The entire night sky has vanished.
The stars are gone. Noah should have been dead. He wasn't sure why he wasn't. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't feel anything except the crushing weight pressing down on his chest. His body was numb, sluggish, distant, but the pain was still there, dull and gnawing at the edges of his awareness, whispering that he was still alive enough to suffer. Sand filled his mouth, his tongue was thick with dust, choking him with its dry, suffocating presence. His suit's environmental seals had failed. He could taste the grit between his teeth, feel the grains grinding against his gums, coating the inside of his throat with the essence of Mars itself. His oxygen alarms should have been screaming at him, but there was nothing, just silence, a stillness so complete that it felt unnatural, wrong, as if the entire world had gone quiet to watch him die. He tried to move, but his limbs refused to obey. His fingers barely twitched beneath the weight of the sand, his joints frozen, servos unresponsive. He didn't know how long he had been buried. Hours, days, longer. His mind could barely grasp the concept of time anymore. He wasn't even sure if he was still dreaming, if this was just another trick of his oxygen-starved brain. Something had buried him. Not a storm, not an accident. He had been left here, placed here, suffocating beneath the surface, while the world above moved on without him. The creatures had buried him. A surge of panic snapped his body into motion. His right arm jerked free first, bursting upward through the sand, fingers clawing at the open air, desperate for something to hold onto. His body twisted, muscles screaming as he forced his way up, inch by inch, lungs heaving, the suffocating pressure around him shifting just enough for him to break through. With one final desperate push, he dragged himself free, collapsing onto the shifting dunes, red dust cascading off his shoulders as he gasped for air. His suit finally registered the pressure change, oxygen flooding into his helmet, filling his lungs with something clean, something pure. He coughed violently, the sound raw and wet, flecks of sand sticking to the inside of his visor as he tried to focus, tried to remember what had happened. For a long moment he simply lay there, motionless, staring upward. And that was when he realized the worst thing of all. There were no stars. The Martian night stretched above him, vast and endless, but something was wrong. The familiar thin haze of the upper atmosphere, the tiny distant glows of Phobos and Deimos, the faint shimmer of Jupiter beyond the dust storms, all of it was gone. Just blackness. A void where the universe should have been. His breath hitched. He blinked hard, tried to focus, tried to adjust his visor's filters. Maybe the storm had left interference. Maybe his helmet's optics were still coated in too much dust. But no, he could see the horizon, the dunes, the faint lights of the colony flickering in the distance. Everything else was still there. Everything except the sky. His throat clicked dryly as he tried to speak, but all that came out was a rasping breath. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice past his lips, barely a whisper in the silence. They're gone. His fingers clenched weakly into the sand, his pulse pounding in his ears, hammering at his temples as the realization sank deeper into his bones. The stars are gone. His calm crackled. A voice, distant, broken, barely a whisper. "Noah, is that you?" His head swam. His body refused to move. The weight of exhaustion dragged him downward again, his vision tunneling, narrowing, the edges of the world flickering in and out like a dying signal. The voice came again, distorted, wavering. "Noah, come in. Are you reading this?" He forced air into his lungs, tried to focus, tried to push himself up, but his body refused to cooperate. His hands trembled, and all he could manage was a single word, barely more than a whisper. "Help." The transmission cut out. Somehow he managed to get to his feet and stumble the last few hundred yards to civilization. Noah staggered toward the colony's entrance, his body heavy, his thoughts fragmented, his vision still swimming in the aftermath of suffocation and exhaustion. The reinforced bulkhead of Access Hub A loomed ahead, half buried in the Martian dust, its steel edges worn by years of storms. A cold blue light flickered above the entrance, barely visible through the haze. He dragged himself forward, every motion a battle. His gloved hand slammed against the external panel, his fingers trembling, barely able to form a fist. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. He was alone. Then the airlock hissed to life, a dull, mechanical groan as it slid open, revealing the narrow corridor beyond. He staggered inside, the pressurized chamber sealing behind him with a heavy metallic clang. A sterilization cycle kicked in, misting his suit with a thin layer of decontaminants, his helmet display flashing warnings about internal pressure variances and suit integrity failures. He barely registered them. The elevator descended to the habitant area with a gentle whoosh. Then the inner doors unlocked, and the first real sight of the colony greeted him. The corridors of Martian colony Delta 12 stretched ahead in clean, functional symmetry. White-paneled walls, recessed lighting, low-ceilinged hallways, branching off into research stations, storage units, and personnel quarters. It was exactly as he had left it. Nothing had changed. That was the first thing that unsettled him. Everything was normal. The air smelled the same. Sterile, processed through the filtration systems buried deep underground. The low thrum of the oxygen pumps filled the silence, rhythmic, constant. Colonists moved through the halls with the same expressions of quiet focus, some carrying data pads, others engaged in hushed conversations. There were no alarms, no security lockdowns, no frantic emergency teams rushing to find him. Didn't they know? Didn't they see? Noah's fingers dug into the fabric of his suit, his breath hitched in his throat. Normal was wrong. He nearly collapsed at the first security checkpoint. Talia was waiting for him, her expression unreadable. She stood near the bulkhead separating the entry corridor from the main living quarters, her dark hair tied back, a data pad clipped to her belt. The moment she saw him, his cracked visor, the dried blood along his collar, the raw exhaustion in his eyes, her frown deepened. "Noah, what happened? You should get right to medical." Noah ignored her. His voice scraped against his throat like broken glass. "Where's the comms officer?" Talia didn't move, didn't blink. He saw the momentary calculation in her expression, the slight shift in her posture. "Now," he said sternly. She exhaled, slow and measured, and nodded. The communications hub was smaller than he remembered, compact, enclosed, with rows of terminals lining the walls, the soft hum of data transmissions filling the air. The colony's AI interface pulsed against the main console, a cold, mechanical presence watching from the screen. As soon as Noah entered, the AI spoke. Noah confirmed. "Atmospheric integrity stable. Communications relay active. Welcome back." His stomach turned at the sound of it. He stepped forward, gripping the edge of the nearest console, his fingers pressing into the metal hard enough to hurt. The screens flickered, scrolling through the latest transmission logs. There they were, outgoing messages, standard check-ins, status reports. Every single one had been transmitted successfully. Noel's pulse roared in his ears. Talia stood beside him, arms crossed. "Everything's fine. Last relay to Earth was 2 hours ago." His breath came in short, uneven bursts, his muscles locked in place. He turned toward her, his voice barely above a whisper. "And they responded?" She hesitated, just for a second. Noah saw it, the shift, the way she pulled in a breath, the tiny flicker of uncertainty in her otherwise composed expression. "Not yet," she admitted. "But that happens sometimes, you know that. Delays, timing mismatches." "No." The word snapped out of him before he could stop it. Talia's jaw tightened. I get that you're in shock. Look outside. His voice was shaking now. Tell me what you see. Talia didn't argue. With an irritated sigh, she tapped the console panel, pulling up the external camera feeds. The Martian landscape filled the screen, endless dunes stretching beneath a clear, star-filled sky. Phobos and Deimos hung above the horizon, exactly where they should be. Jupiter shimmered faintly in the distance. Noah's vision blurred, his head swam. It was wrong. He was looking at the same sky as before, but now it was full of stars. The same constellations, the same patterns, the universe exactly as it should be. He stumbled back, his breathing ragged, panic crawling through his chest. Why? His voice broke. Why are they there? Talia blinked. What are you talking about? He turned away from the screen, his hands gripping his skull. He squeezed his eyes shut, tried to remember what the sky was supposed to look like. He'd seen it outside, he knew he had. Blackness, nothing. But here, on this screen, it was all still there. Talia sighed, rubbing her temple. Noah, you need to sit down. You're dehydrated, injured, probably concussed. I don't see anything. The words fell from his mouth, flat, empty, final. Talia stopped. For the first time she hesitated. She studied him now, her eyes shifting slightly, her stance adjusting. She had known him for years. Knew when he was lying, when he was panicking, when he was seeing something real. And for the first time, uncertainty crept into her features. Noah swallowed hard, his throat tight. His fingers clenched at his sides. Then, without a word, Talia reached forward and turned off the screen. Noah sat on the edge of the medical cot, his hands gripping the thin mattress beneath him as if grounding himself to something real. The room was small, sterile, built into the deeper levels of the colony, where the walls were thicker, the silence heavier. A faint hum filled the air, oxygen pumps cycling, vitals monitors tracking his pulse. Talia had left him here under Dr. Lorne's care, insisting that he rest, hydrate, get his head checked out. He had neither the patience nor the desire for any of that. His thoughts were still spinning, his heart beat too loud in his ears. The stars were gone. Or maybe they weren't. He had seen the black sky, the emptiness swallowing the heavens, but on the colony's screens the stars had been right where they always were. Had he hallucinated it? Had the Martian storm and oxygen deprivation screwed with his mind? No, because Talia had hesitated. Because something in her expression had changed in that moment, like she knew something, even if she didn't want to admit it. He exhaled, slow and measured, staring at his reflection in the small medical mirror mounted on the far wall. He looked hollowed out, pale, exhausted. His suit was gone now, replaced by standard colony fatigues, his body cleaned of dust and dried blood. He should have felt better. He didn't. A knock at the door pulled him out of his thoughts. Dr. Lorne stepped inside, carrying a tablet, his expression neutral. He was a quiet, practical man in his 50s, more pragmatic than empathetic, the kind of doctor who saw patients as problems to be solved, rather than people to be reassured. "How's the head?" Lorne asked, his tone neutral. Noah shrugged. "Painful. I'm alive, at least. That's a start." The doctor tapped the screen of his tablet. "Vitals are stabilizing. Blood oxygen still a little low, but within acceptable levels. You took a beating out there, but nothing permanent." Noah didn't respond. Lorne sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Look, I read the debrief. You were buried under the sand for hours. You were hypoxic, hallucinating, disoriented. That explains the memory lapses, the paranoia. You lost your team, Noah. I'm not sure what really happened out there, but it'll be hard to deal with." Noah's hands clenched against his knees. "I wasn't hallucinating." Lorne gave him a long, unreadable look. "Noah, the stars are still there." Noah's jaw tightened. "You need to let your body recover," Lorne continued. "Your mind will catch up." The medical wing was connected to the science module, a long corridor leading toward one of the colony's main observatories. Lorne had finally let him go after another round of vitals, under the condition that he rest in his quarters afterward. That wasn't going to happen. Instead, Noah made his way toward the observation deck. He wasn't going to trust the colony's external cameras, not after what happened in the comms hub. He needed to see it himself, directly. The observatory was small but functional, built into a reinforced dome structure, its telescopic arrays capable of viewing everything from Mars moons to deep space anomalies. As he entered, he found Connor Hale, one of the research techs, hunched over the main viewing terminal, adjusting focus. Connor glanced up. "Heard you were back from the dead?" Noah barely acknowledged him. He moved toward the second terminal, the one connected to the primary telescope. He sat, exhaled, and activated the feed. The screen flickered. The automated systems adjusted, zoomed in, refocused. The Martian sky should have been laid out before him in crystal-clear detail. Instead, the screen went black. Noah's body locked up. He swallowed hard, adjusting the settings manually, overriding the autofocus. Nothing. His hands felt numb as he turned to Connor. "Pull up your feed." Connor frowned but complied. His terminal flickered and the stars appeared immediately. The sky was full. Phobos, Deimos, distant constellations, the endless stretch of space. Noah's chest tightened. His screen remained a void. "What are you doing?" Connor asked, frowning. Noah didn't answer. He stood, switching places. Connor sat down at Noah's station, pulling up the telescope feed. The moment Connor looked at the screen, stars. Perfectly normal. Noah stared at the monitor, then at Connor, then back at the empty black void on his own display. His hands felt cold. The AI chimed in over the speaker. "Sensor anomaly detected. Recalibrating." Noah inhaled sharply. "You only say that when I'm looking, don't you?" The AI did not respond. Connor rubbed his temple. "All right. That's weird." Noah turned to him. "What do you see?" "The usual. Orion, Jupiter, a couple of distant clusters." Connor shrugged. "What do you see?" Noah clenched his teeth. "Nothing." Connor hesitated. "Maybe the optics are damaged? The system was hit with a storm recently. Try looking outside." Connor frowned, but humored him. He walked toward the observation window, stepping past the terminals, standing beneath the curved dome that overlooked the Martian sky. He glanced up and froze. His body stiffened, his breath hitching, his hands clenched at his sides. Noah's stomach dropped. Connor was seeing it. For a long moment, the younger man simply stood there, motionless. Then, very slowly, he turned back toward Noah, his face pale, his mouth slightly open. "What's happening?" Noah stepped forward. "What do you see?" Connor's eyes flicked toward the observation window again, then back at the telescope screen, where the stars were still there, clear as ever. His fingers curled into fists. "They're gone." His voice was barely a whisper. "The stars are gone." Noah let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For the first time since escaping the sand, he wasn't alone. The colony's weekly transmission to Earth was scheduled for 800 sharp. It was a ritual, routine check-ins, status updates, data reports. The AI handled most of it, encrypting and compressing the outgoing signals before relaying them through the orbital satellite array. Even at their distance, the delay was expected, a 35-minute lag between message and response. But today there was no response, no delay warning, no acknowledgement ping from Earth, no system errors, just silence. Noah sat in the communications hub, staring at the transmission logs, his jaw tight, his hands curled into fists. Talia stood beside him, arms crossed, her face unreadable as she watched the data scroll. The screen showed the usual outgoing signals, every one of them marked as successfully sent. but nothing had come back. Talia exhaled sharply. It happens sometimes. Could be solar interference, could be a relay error. Noah said nothing. We've had delays before. Still he didn't answer. The room was too quiet. The soft hum of the servers, the ambient background noise of the station, it all felt like it was hiding something. He looked up at the main status display, the connection logs ticking down, waiting for the next cycle. Let's give it another hour. Talia's voice was firm, reasonable, like she was convincing herself as much as she was him. Noah swallowed, his throat dry. It's not coming. They waited. An hour, then another. Noah stayed in the comms hub, watching the outgoing messages stack up with no confirmation pings in return. The AI continued reporting successful transmissions, but nothing ever bounced back. By midday, other department heads gathered, some concerned, others irritated. Dr. Lorne, ever the rationalist, shook his head. We can't assume anything after a few hours. Relays go down all the time. Last year we had a 40-hour blackout because of a solar flare. Noah barely glanced at him. Then why aren't we getting even a system ping? Could be transmission lag, data congestion? No way. Lorne frowned, but Noah wasn't interested in arguing. Something was wrong. He felt it, deep in his chest, like a wire stretched too tight, ready to snap. They weren't just missing a response. Earth wasn't there anymore. By nightfall, 2 more colonists saw it. The black sky, the missing stars, the empty void. It started with Connor Hale, who had seen it with Noah in the observatory the night before. He hadn't spoken about it, not openly. But now, standing in one of the external corridors with a clear viewport, he wasn't alone. Lena, one of the mining engineers, had been the first to whisper, her voice barely audible. Where's Jupiter? At first Connor hadn't understood. Then he had followed her line of sight through the window, past the artificial lighting, along the colony's perimeter, past the dunes and the ridgeline, to the black sky above. No Phobos, no Deimos, no stars. He didn't speak, he just swallowed hard, his pulse hammering in his throat. Lena turned toward him, her eyes wide. You see it too, don't you? He nodded. By the time Noah got the report, there were 5 colonists who could see the black sky. 5 people who, just like him, couldn't see past the void. The others, they still saw the stars. In the main corridor, tension was already rising. Connor stood near the viewport with Lena, another technician named John, and 2 security officers. Across from them, Lorne and several others stood stiffly, arms crossed. It's hysteria. Lorne's voice was clipped, sharp. A shared stress response. The mind can play tricks on you, especially after sleep deprivation. We've just lost a whole team except for 1 survivor. This is all just an unhealthy stress response. Tricks? Lena's voice cracked. I know what I saw. I'm not sleep deprived. I'm not hallucinating. It's gone, all of it. I still see the sky just fine, Lorne countered, same as it's always been. Noah stepped between them, his jaw tight. It's not a hallucination. Lorne scoffed. So what? The universe just vanished? That's what you're suggesting? That Mars is floating in a void with no solar system? Do you even hear how insane that sounds? Noah didn't answer, because there was no answer. Lorne sighed, rubbing his temple. Until we have real evidence, I'm considering this a psychological event, nothing more. He turned to Talia, who had been silent this entire time, her arms crossed. We need a full medical evaluation on everyone who claims to see this. Neurochecks, stress screenings. There's an explanation for this. What about the transmission blackout? Noah asked, his voice cold. Lorne didn't look at him. He didn't have an answer for that one. That night, another transmission cycle was scheduled. Noah sat in the comms hub again, watching the countdown clock tick toward 0, waiting for the AI to send another batch of outgoing messages. Talia was beside him, her fingers drumming against her knee, eyes locked on the data feed. She hadn't said much since the argument in the corridor. The AI chirped softly as it initiated the sequence. The signal fired. Noah held his breath. The countdown clock reset. The AI chirped again. Transmission confirmed. Message sent. Noah's hands curled into fists. He didn't even realize he was holding his breath until he exhaled. Delivered to where? Talia ran a secondary scan. No error codes, no system faults. Noah licked his lips, his throat dry. Try a deep-range signal scan. She hesitated, then nodded. Her fingers flew across the console. The long-range sensor array pulsed outward, reaching beyond Mars, reaching for the relays, for the orbital satellites, for something, anything. The screen flickered. The response time ticked up. The signal bounced back. Instantly, no delay, no lag, as if the signal had hit something solid and come back. Talia stared. That's not possible. Noah's mouth went dry. The first sign of movement came at 0213 hours. Riley had been on security rotation, watching the external sensors from the control station near the main airlock. The system had been acting up for weeks, ever since the storms had buried half the outer modules, so she barely glanced at the proximity alert when it flashed across the screen. Another glitch, another error in the system. At least, that's what she thought. Until she checked the thermal feed, there was something outside. Not a dust storm, not a shadow from the ridge, but something low to the ground, shifting just beyond the perimeter. The motion was wrong, jerky. Riley froze. Her fingers hovered over the terminal, her breath held as she watched the faint, skittering shapes moving along the far edge of the colony's dome. And then they disappeared, gone in an instant. The airlock controls blinked red, a pressure seal disengaged. And yet, there was no alarm. Noah had been in his bunk when the station-wide announcement went off. The artificial female voice of the AI crackled through the intercom, soft and sterile. All personnel report to primary containment zones. Unauthorized airlock breach detected, pressure loss recorded. He was already moving. By the time he reached the security station, Riley was there, her hands tight around the edge of the console. Talia was behind her, arms crossed, face pale but unreadable. Noah's pulse hammered in his ears as he scanned the alert logs. Tell me this is a mistake. Riley's jaw clenched. It's not. Which module? Maintenance corridor near sublevel B. She exhaled, slow and shaky. 2 people were inside when it happened. Chen and Morris. Noah's stomach twisted. And? Riley turned toward him, her face cold. They never came out. The lights died at 0247. Not a flicker, not a surge. Just a single pulse of static followed by total blackout. The air turned cold. For a long, horrible moment, nothing moved. Then the screaming started. Noah grabbed for the emergency flashlight at his belt, the dim beam barely cutting through the dark. The security alarms weren't going off. The AI was silent. And then the metal groaned. Something was inside the walls. The first fatality was confirmed within 5 minutes. Lena was found halfway into an access shaft, blood smeared against the paneling. No external wounds, no signs of struggle. It was like she had been dragged there and left. Connor went missing next. 1 second he was with the evacuation team, the next he was just gone. No camera footage, no comm signal, just empty space where he should have been. By then Noah understood. They had waited, watched, and now they were closing in. Doors locked and unlocked at random. The AI's voice crackled through the comms, repeating fragments of past conversations, its programming degrading into incoherent static. No, confirmed. Transmission received, transmission lost, transmission never sent. You're not alone. Talia swore under her breath, slamming the manual override. Nothing worked. AI's been compromised. Noah didn't bother answering. He was staring at the emergency monitor, watching the red dots move through the colony schematics. Except they weren't registered personnel, they weren't wearing suits, and they weren't moving like people. Noah, Talia, and Riley barricaded themselves in the main control room. The doors sealed, the lights flickering, the emergency console the only thing still active. Outside, the colony was failing. Oxygen pumps sputtered, power drained in uneven surges, and the AI continued to loop nonsense. And then, silence. No more screaming, no more movement, just a deep, suffocating quiet. Noah stood near the bulkhead, his breath shallow, his fingers tightening around the grip of his sidearm. Then, slowly, he turned toward the viewing window. And there they were. A row of shadows, standing perfectly still in the corridor beyond, watching, waiting, their limbs folded, their heads tilted in eerie synchronization. Their elongated bodies cast deep shadows in the flickering light. They didn't move. The emergency lights dimmed. Then, one by one, they went out completely. The last thing Noah saw before the colony was swallowed by darkness was their eyes, watching, still watching. Noah crouched behind an overturned supply crate, his pulse hammering in his ears. The control room had been overrun in minutes. The creatures had surged into the colony like a tide, moving through the vents, the maintenance shafts, the reinforced bulkheads as if the walls themselves had no meaning to them. He had fired until his gun had gone empty, until the heat sinks were glowing red, but it didn't matter. The creatures were too fast, too fluid, their elongated forms twisting around cover, moving through the dark with inhuman precision. Across from him, Riley was bleeding, one hand pressed against her side, the other gripping a pistol that shook slightly in her grasp. Her breaths were ragged, coming too fast, but she was still moving. She had always been the toughest of them, the one who pushed through injuries, through exhaustion, through fear, but now even she looked frayed. "Talia," Noah called out, his voice low, barely above a whisper. "The grid. How much power do we have left?" Talia was hunched over the manual override console, her hands moving fast across the interface. The emergency lighting cast shadows across her face, making her look older, more hollowed out. "Not enough for a full restart," she muttered. "But maybe—" She didn't finish the sentence. Something scraped against the ceiling panels. Noah stiffened, his fingers tightening around his empty sidearm. Slowly, his eyes tracked upward. The dim light barely cut through the dark, but he could see them. The things were above them now, clinging to the walls, to the vents, to the steel panels. They weren't attacking, not yet. Talia let out a slow breath, her fingers hesitating over the controls. "I can reroute emergency power," she whispered. "It won't hold, but it'll give us one last pulse." Noah didn't take his eyes off the creatures. "Do it." Talia flipped the switch. A surge of energy roared through the colony, ionized pulses ripping through the air, static crackling through the vents. The lights flared back to life for an instant, bright enough to burn after so much darkness. The monsters screeched. Sharp, discordant, something unnatural twisting through the frequency of their cries. They pulled back into the shadows, slipping through vents, through open maintenance hatches, their forms vanishing one by one. The last one lingered in the corridor for just a second longer than the others. It tilted its head in that same eerie way, as if it were memorizing the moment, calculating something Noah didn't understand. Then it, too, disappeared. Noah let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. For the moment they had won, but something was still wrong. The external cameras rebooted, the screens flickered to life, the system cycling through the security feeds, restoring visuals of the Martian surface. Noah exhaled, stepping toward the monitors, his fingers tightening against the edge of the console. The first feed came online, the perimeter cameras. The colony's outer modules stood intact, bathed in the thin reddish haze of the Martian atmosphere. The dunes stretched outward, undisturbed except for the faint remnants of shifting dust. The second feed. the North Ridge. The same landscape, the same silence. The third, the main observation deck. Noah felt the breath in his lungs freeze. There were no stars. The screen showed nothing but blackness. No Jupiter, no Saturn, no distant constellations, not even the faint shimmer of Phobos and Deimos. Just emptiness. Noah's mouth was dry, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Check the system," he said, his voice hoarse, uneven. "Recalibrate the optics." Talia was already moving, hands shaking as she ran the diagnostics. She barely had to wait for the response. The system wasn't malfunctioning. Noah turned toward the observation window, his movements slow, deliberate, dreading what he knew he would see. The Martian sky was gone. The vast expanse that should have stretched above them, the familiar glow of distant planets, of stars billions of years old, none of it existed anymore. Riley pressed a hand against the glass, her breath shallow. "This isn't possible." Talia whispered something under her breath, something too soft for Noah to catch. Earth was gone. Everything beyond Mars was gone. The solar system no longer existed. Noah stared into the abyss above them, feeling something vast, something unfathomable, pressing against the edges of reality. The intruders had never needed to kill them. They had simply taken everything else away. Noah turned away from the terminal, his legs heavy as he walked toward the viewport. He moved slowly, as if his body had already accepted what his mind didn't want to process. The others stayed behind, still searching, still trying to fight against the inevitable. The glass was cold beneath his fingertips as he pressed a hand against it, staring outward into the Martian sky. The stars were still gone. The void stretched infinitely in every direction, consuming everything that should have been there. No planets, no moons, no distant constellations. It wasn't just darkness, it was nothingness. The absence of existence itself. Riley's voice was quiet. "What do we do now?" Noah didn't answer. He wasn't sure there was an answer. He closed his eyes, exhaling slow, steady, his breath fogging against the glass. "They buried me, you know. You can't outrun the dark."
Enjoy this story? Subscribe to Free Science Fiction Stories for daily sci-fi adventures.